He thought he could trust her with everything, until I uncovered the ledger that changed everything. I never imagined that grief could carry the bitter taste of betrayal. When my father passed away, I thought the hardest part would be saying goodbye to him. But the real heartbreak came later, when I discovered how deeply I had been deceived. My father had always been my anchor, the man I looked up to, the one who taught me discipline, work ethic, and the value of family. I was with him in the hospital during his final weeks, holding his hand as he drifted in and out of consciousness. I made sure he was comfortable, that his wishes were respected, and that he never felt alone. When the day of the will reading arrived, I walked into that lawyer's office expecting to feel a sense of closure, maybe even gratitude for the years I'd sacrificed to take care of him. Instead, I felt my entire world collapse. Every single asset, our childhood home, the small business my father built from scratch, even the savings account he had always promised would be split between me and my half-brother, was left solely to my stepmother and her son. My name wasn't mentioned once. Not a single acknowledgement of the years I had given up to be by his side. The room spun as I sat there, numb, listening to the lawyer's voice drone on. I glanced at my stepmother. Her face was expressionless, almost cold, like this was exactly how she had planned it. And in that moment, a dark realization began to sink in. This wasn't some oversight. This wasn't my father forgetting me. This was deliberate. This was manipulation. That's when the seed of suspicion took root inside me. Suspicion that my stepmother had orchestrated everything, right down to the papers my father had been too weak to read in his final days. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place, and none of them sat right with me. In those last months of my father's life, my stepmother had inserted herself into everything. At first, I chalked it up to concern. She was his wife after all. But looking back, it feels more like control. She was always the one who answered his phone, screening calls before deciding if he was well enough to talk. She insisted on handling his medications, never letting me near them, saying it was too complicated for me to understand. When I tried to spend time alone with him, she hovered nearby, always finding an excuse to interrupt or cut our visits short. There was one day in particular that now haunts me. My father had asked for me, specifically me, to go over some papers with him. But when I arrived, those papers were already neatly stacked on the coffee table, and my stepmother said he was too tired to go through them. I remember the flicker of confusion in his eyes when I walked into the room. He tried to speak, but she gave him a glass of water, coaxed him into bed, and told me it wasn't the right time. At the time, I trusted her. Now, I can't shake the thought that those papers were the will, and she made sure I wasn't there to hear what he truly wanted. Every memory of those weeks feels tainted now. Every polite smile, every reassurance she gave me that your father is in good hands. Because if what I suspect is true, she wasn't protecting him. She was protecting her plan. The first real crack in the story appeared when I ran into my father's old attorney at the grocery store. He had been with my dad for years, the kind of man who never minced words and always prided himself on transparency. When he asked how I was holding up, I mentioned how grateful I was that my stepmother had handled everything. That's when his expression changed. It was only for a second, but it was unmistakable. A flicker of hesitation, almost guilt, before he quickly shifted back into his professional smile. He muttered something about how my father had made last-minute changes and how those situations are always complicated. But my father was not a man of last-minute decisions. He was methodical, careful, a planner to the very core of his being. He never signed a document without reading it 3 times. So why would he, in his final weeks, when he was so weak he could barely hold a pen, suddenly decide to rewrite his will in a rush? That single conversation gnawed at me for days. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, just kept replaying that attorney's face over and over. Something about the way he avoided eye contact, the way his voice dipped when he said complicated, made my stomach turn. Then came the nurse, one of the women who had cared for my father during his decline. I visited the clinic to settle a few final bills, and she recognized me immediately. She pulled me aside, lowering her voice as if she was afraid someone might overhear. She said she'd been worried about how pressured my father had seemed in those last weeks, not by his illness, but by someone close to him. Her words hit me like a thunderclap. Pressured. That was the exact word she used. My father, the man who had built his life on integrity and independence, pressured into decisions at his weakest. She didn't say who, but I didn't need her to. I walked out of that clinic with my hands trembling, my mind spinning. For the first time, it wasn't just a suspicion gnawing at me. It felt like the walls of a bigger truth were starting to close in. And deep down, I knew I was about to uncover something that would change everything I thought I knew about my father's final days. When I finally forced myself to look at the copy of my father's will, my chest tightened. I had been avoiding it, convincing myself that reading it would only reopen the wound. But after what the nurse had said, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The first thing that struck me was the handwriting. My father had always signed with a firm, almost calligraphic script, each letter sharp, deliberate, with a confident flourish at the end. The signature on this document looked like a shadow of his. Shaky, uneven, and strangely compressed, as if whoever wrote it had been rushed, or worse, forced. Then came the clauses themselves. My father, a man of meticulous fairness, had always spoken about treating me and my sister equally. He believed in balance, in leaving no room for resentment. Yet here, the distribution was glaringly lopsided. Entire properties, investments, and accounts had been shifted entirely to my stepmother, while my share was whittled down to sentimental trinkets, a few heirlooms, a watch, some old letters. And then there was the strangest part of all, a clause that left her with the full power to distribute or withhold assets as she sees fit. My father hated ambiguity. He would never have signed off on something so open-ended. I felt my throat tighten as I read it again and again. This wasn't just favoritism. This looked engineered, manipulated. Every line felt like it had been carefully designed to funnel everything into her hands. And the shaky signature at the bottom screamed of a man too weak or too pressured to resist. That I closed the folder and just sat there, staring at the wall. The anger in me was boiling over, mixing with grief in a way that felt unbearable. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about principle, about the fact that my father's last wishes, his legacy, might not have been his at all. And with that realization, one burning question lodged itself in my mind. If she was willing to manipulate him on paper, what else had she done in those final weeks when none of us were watching? The next step for me was simple. I needed to stop relying on my own suspicions and find voices beyond my own. My father's decline had been slow, stretched out over months, and plenty of people had seen him in those fragile moments. If my stepmother had pulled strings behind the scenes, someone must have caught a glimpse of it. I started with the nurse who had first dropped that uneasy comment. I pressed her gently, trying not to sound accusatory, but her hesitation only made my pulse race. She told me that in the last weeks, my father had been visibly weaker, often disoriented, sometimes unable to even hold a pen without trembling. Yet, she said, there were several occasions when my stepmother insisted he sign some papers. The nurse admitted she wasn't present in the room for most of it, but she had once entered just as my stepmother was guiding his hand across a page, her grip tight around his wrist. That image lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. My father wasn't the type to let anyone guide him. For someone else to take control of his hand, it felt like a violation, a theft of his very autonomy. I didn't stop there. I reached out to one of his old business associates, a man who had visited once during his illness. He remembered walking in and finding my father visibly upset, his voice raised, though too weak to be forceful. He said he overheard fragments, words like unfair and not what I wanted. But when my stepmother noticed him, she quickly ushered him out, smiling tightly as if nothing had happened. Each piece of testimony, small on its own, together painted a picture I could no longer ignore. My father, weakened and fading, had been cornered, perhaps even coerced. My stepmother had stood there in the shadows, waiting for her moment to seize control of everything he had built. And as I gathered these fragments, I realized something chilling. If I was right, then the will wasn't just wrong, it was a fraud. A fraud written in shaky lines and buried under the silence of those too polite, too afraid, or too loyal to speak up. But now, I had to decide what to do with this knowledge. Do I confront her head-on, risk tearing open a war I might not be able to win? Or do I bide my time, collect more evidence, and strike only when I'm certain the truth will stand on its own? The decision was made for me one night when I went back to my father's study. The room had been locked since the funeral, but I still had a copy of the old brass key. Stepping inside felt like walking into his presence again. The faint smell of cigar smoke still clung to the curtains, and his desk sat exactly as he'd left it, a fortress of papers, ledgers, and carefully stacked files that I wasn't sure what I was looking for, only that I needed something concrete, something that would speak louder than suspicions and whispers. I began pulling open drawers, running my fingers across folders filled with contracts, old tax documents, and receipts from decades of business. Most of it was ordinary, but then, buried beneath an envelope of insurance papers, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a ledger, not in my father's handwriting, but hers, my stepmother's. Neat, deliberate, and chillingly precise. Each page was a list of dates and amounts, transfers marked with arrows from one account to another. But what caught my eye wasn't just the meticulous record-keeping. It was the fact that some of these transactions had been made months before my father's health declined, and every single one of them funneled money quietly into her personal accounts. At the bottom of one page was a note scrawled in her hand. Consolidate after probate. Probate, the legal process that would validate my father's will after his death. She had planned this. She wasn't just waiting for him to die. She had been preparing for the moment she could sweep in and take everything. While the ink was still drying on his death certificate, I stared at that ledger until the words blurred. My chest tightened, not just from anger, but from grief. My father had trusted her. He'd let her into his home, into his final years when he was most vulnerable. And she had turned those moments into calculations and strategies. It wasn't just fraud anymore. It was betrayal on a level that felt personal, venomous, and premeditated. And now I had proof. But proof came with its own danger. If she realized I had it, she wouldn't hesitate to destroy me, legally or otherwise. This ledger was my weapon, but it was also a target painted squarely on my back. From the moment I tucked that ledger under my jacket and locked my father's study behind me, I felt as though the house itself was watching me. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the old windows felt like her eyes, tracking my movements. The next morning confirmed my fears. At breakfast, she was already at the table, dressed immaculately as always, her hair pinned back, makeup flawless. She never looked disheveled, not even in mourning, which in itself felt unnatural. She greeted me with that tight-lipped smile she reserved for when she wanted to remind me who held the power now. But what made my stomach twist was the way she spoke. Her words seemed harmless at first, asking if I'd slept well, commenting on how I seemed tired. Yet, there was a deliberate weight behind every sentence, as though she were measuring my reactions. Then she said something that chilled me. Funny thing about old houses, she mused, sipping her tea. You never know who's wandering around at night. Some doors creak more than others. I nearly dropped my cup. She knew, or at least she suspected. For the rest of the day, I caught her glancing at me when she thought I wasn't looking, her expression cool, predatory. Once, when I walked into the living room, I found her already there, flipping through one of my father's photo albums. She closed it quickly and gave me a smile so sharp it felt like a blade. It was a game now, and we both knew it. I had the proof she feared, and she had the resources to bury me if I made a wrong move. Each meal, each passing in the hallway felt like a battle of wills, where one slip could cost me everything. The tension became unbearable when I noticed something else. My room had been disturbed. Papers I'd left on the desk were slightly shifted. A drawer I knew I'd locked was left ajar. She had been searching. It was no longer a question of if she knew. It was only a matter of how much. That evening, the storm outside was relentless. Rain pounded against the roof, and the wind howled through the cracks in the shutters. I sat at my desk, the ledger hidden in a locked drawer beneath me, trying to steady my thoughts. But then I heard it, 3 sharp knocks at my door. When I opened it, she was standing there. My stepmother, perfectly calm, perfectly composed, as if the storm hadn't touched her. She didn't ask permission to come in. She simply stepped past me, her perfume trailing behind her like a warning. She walked slowly around the room, her eyes sweeping across my desk, my shelves, even my bed, before finally settling on me. You know, she said, her tone light, almost playful, your father always hated snoops. He used to say curiosity was the fastest way to ruin. I felt my throat tighten. She wasn't hiding the threat anymore. Then, with deliberate precision, she set something on my desk. My locked drawer key. The very one I kept hidden in the lining of my jacket pocket. I froze. If she had the key, it meant she had been in here. She had touched my things, searched my room. She had been inside my world while I slept. And I hadn't even known. Some things, she continued, leaning close enough that I could smell the sharp sweetness of her perfume, are better left untouched. You wouldn't want to trip over secrets that don't belong to you. And just like that, she turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind her. I sat there, staring at the key she had left behind, my hands trembling. The message was clear. She knew. She wasn't afraid of me. And now, it was no longer a game of quiet suspicion. It was war. After that night, the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a trap. Every corner seemed alive with shadows. Every creak of the floorboards a warning that she was near. I couldn't shake the thought that if she had been bold enough to slip into my room once, she could do it again. What else had she seen? What else had she taken? I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, but the evidence was too clear. The key on my desk wasn't just a warning. It was proof she could reach me whenever she wanted. Even in my most private sanctuary, I was not safe. That I began to notice little changes in the house. The window latch in my room left open when I knew I had closed it. My boots moved slightly from where I had set them by the door. And once, I found a hairpin on my desk, delicate, silver, and definitely not mine. It was as if she was leaving a trail, constant reminders that I was being watched, tested, toyed with. I considered leaving, packing what little I had, and walking out into the night. But where would I go? This was still my father's house, his legacy. If I left, she would win by default, burying every truth along with him. I stayed, but I no longer slept. I kept a candle burning through the night, my chair angled toward the door, waiting for the sound of footsteps. My every nerve was on edge, my mind racing with plans I didn't have the courage yet to act on. And yet, beneath all that fear, a new thought took root. If I didn't outsmart her soon, I wasn't going to survive this house much longer. I realized pretty quickly that anger alone wasn't a strategy. It was a fuel, hot, volatile, but useless if I didn't shape it into something smart. If I wanted to fight her, I needed a plan that didn't rely on bravado or late-night confrontations. I needed evidence, allies, and a way to move without tipping my hand. The ledger in my drawer was a start, but it was fragile proof at best, damning if presented right, worthless if she got to it first. So I began to think like the kind of person who wins quiet wars. First, safety. I made a list of the most important items I could not afford to lose. The ledger, my father's original passports and deeds, copies of any messages or receipts that mentioned transfers. I gathered them into a small satchel and hid it in a place even she wouldn't suspect. A hollow in the attic beam my father used to store firewood in winter. It was old, dusty, and the sort of place she'd never bother to look, because in her thinking, the house belonged to her now. I felt ridiculous crawling up there in the dark, my palms smeared with soot, but when the satchel was tucked away, I slept a fraction easier. Second, corroboration. I started contacting people quietly, those who wouldn't feel the pressure of family politics the way I did. The old attorney, the nurse I'd spoken to, the business associate who'd overheard the argument. I met them separately, in cafes and parking lots, and asked direct questions. Each time I found someone who remembered a detail I hadn't known, it felt like adding another brick to the wall that would eventually surround her lies. Third, documenting everything. I began keeping a notebook, writing down times, conversations, changes in the house, and small, seemingly innocuous things that, when strung together, would reveal a pattern. I photographed bank statements with my phone, copied emails, saved voicemail timestamps. It was tedious and humiliating in a way. I felt like a private investigator in my own life, but it was necessary. I told myself I was building an archive my future self could not be manipulated out of. Fourth, a legal lifeline. I reached out to a probate attorney I barely knew through a friend and described the irregularities without revealing the ledger. He listened more than he spoke, asked sensible questions, and agreed to look over the will and the circumstances under which my father had signed documents. His presence changed something. Just knowing a professional had his eye on the case felt like a slow-acting balm to the raw panic gnawing at me. And finally, perhaps the riskiest move, I started planting subtle traps to test her. Not traps meant to humiliate, but measures designed to reveal her hand. I sent an email from an old address that only she and I knew my father sometimes used, asking about a made-up investment. I deliberately left a small envelope of fake receipts near the living room table and watched how she reacted. Would she move them? Burn them? Call someone? Each reaction told me more about how she operated. All of this happened in the silence between breakfast and the quiet hours before midnight. I found myself living two lives. The face I kept at the table, polite and civil, and the other, coiled and alert, planning steps 3 moves ahead. I didn't tell anyone else in the family. My sister was still grieving in her own way, and I refused to drag her into a war before I had ammunition she could trust. The day the attorney called me back, calm, precise, and with a voice like a gavel, was the day my plan shifted from simmer to action. He'd reviewed the will and the signatures. He wanted to meet. He had questions that suggested he suspected undue influence. He advised caution. Don't confront her yet. Don't flush out the ledger, and for God's sake, don't let anyone know you're investigating openly. I hung up and stared at the rain tracing lazy paths down the window. For the first time since the will reading, I felt something that wasn't just panic or rage. It was a brittle hope, dangerous, yes, but tangible. I had evidence, allies, and a legal ear that could take the ledger and the testimonies and turn them into something formal, something she couldn't twist away with charm and threats. But there was a cost. Every move I made required deception, small lies to family, evasions to friends, and the theft of my own peace. The house felt colder, as if it resented my plotting. She watched me with that patient, surgical interest, and I knew the moment I slipped, she would strike. The ledger was both my sword and my Achilles heel. That night, before I fell into a fitful sleep, I turned the plan over in my head one last time. The attorney would meet me away from the house. The nurse and the business associate would sign brief statements. I'd produce the ledger, and we'd file an injunction to freeze assets until the probate could be legally reviewed. It was a gamble with everything I owned. If I lost, she would take the house, the business, and my father's name with them. If I won, I might recover more than money. I might recover the truth of my father's last choices. When I finally drifted off, it was with the ledger's ghost in my mind and the resolve that I would not let my father's life be rewritten by a woman whose devotion had been a pretense. The next move would be the most dangerous, getting the ledger safely out and into the hands of someone who could use it. If I succeeded, the house would stop feeling like a trap. If I failed, it would become my tomb. The next morning, I woke with that strange sensation you get when you know a day could shift the entire trajectory of your life. My father's ledger lay hidden in the attic beam, safe but vulnerable, like a secret heartbeat pulsing above my head. I knew I couldn't leave it there forever. Every hour it stayed in the house was another hour she might stumble across it. Or worse, suspect it and tear the place apart until she found it. I crafted a simple but dangerous plan. I'd remove the ledger while she was distracted, get it into the attorney's hands, and then finally breathe. But even something that straightforward carried risk. She had a way of appearing at odd hours, floating through the house like a shadow. If she caught me with that satchel, she wouldn't ask questions. She'd strike. I waited until mid-morning, when she usually took her long calls in the sunroom. Those calls had a rehearsed rhythm to them. Polite laughter, sharp demands, the occasional cooing tone she used with men who clearly adored her attention. I pretended to be absorbed in my own work in the study, but my ears tracked every note of her voice. When the laughter started, a high, practiced trill, I knew she'd be locked in for a while. Quietly, I moved. Each step up the narrow attic ladder felt amplified, like the creak of wood might broadcast my intentions. Dust clung to my shirt as I pulled down the satchel. The ledger's weight was slight, but it felt like a stone against my chest, heavy with consequence. Back in my room, I tucked it beneath a folded sweater in a small duffel bag, already packed with innocuous items, shirts, a toothbrush, a pair of running shoes. To anyone else, it would look like I was heading to the gym or maybe staying at a friend's house. The ledger was just another hidden layer in the ordinary. Timing, though, was everything. I couldn't just walk out the front door. She had a habit of drifting into the foyer unexpectedly, like a sentinel. So I chose the back exit through the kitchen, moving with casual slowness, my pulse thrumming beneath the calm expression I forced onto my face. But as I crossed the threshold, I heard it, the sudden silence from the sunroom. Her call had ended earlier than usual. I froze, the duffel strap biting into my shoulder, every nerve in my body screaming to keep moving but also terrified of what lay one room away. Then came her footsteps, measured, unhurried, deliberate. She entered the kitchen doorway, and her eyes flicked immediately to the bag on my shoulder. For a second, we locked stares. My throat went dry. Heading somewhere? She asked, her tone light, but her gaze sharp, scanning me as if she could see through fabric and bone. I forced a shrug. Just out for a bit. Needed some air. Her lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. More like a test. She leaned against the frame, arms folded, as though deciding whether to push. The silence stretched, and every second felt like a weight dragging me deeper into suspicion. Finally, she gave a little nod, a gesture almost regal in its dismissal. "Don't stay out too long," she said softly, before turning back toward the hall. Relief nearly buckled my knees. I stepped out into the yard, my lungs finally gulping air like I'd been underwater. The ledger was still with me, but I understood then that she was far sharper than I'd given her credit for. That look she'd given me wasn't just casual curiosity. It was suspicion, thinly veiled, like she was cataloging my movements for later dissection. Still, I made it to the car, hands trembling as I slid the duffel into the trunk. The drive to the attorney's office was a blur of paranoia. Every car behind me felt like a tail. Every red light seemed like a trap designed to keep me within her reach. When I finally placed the ledger on the attorney's desk, the weight lifted just enough for me to exhale. He flipped it open, scanned the meticulous entries, and his brows furrowed in recognition. "This," he said after a pause, "changes everything." But even in that moment of fragile victory, I couldn't shake the image of her face as she watched me leave. Not angry, not panicked, just calculating. And I knew in my gut that by moving the ledger, I hadn't just protected myself. I declared war. Would you like me to keep stretching this story further with more layers of psychological pressure and unexpected turns before the resolution? So we hit the 13 to 15-part depth you wanted? Driving back from the attorney's office, I expected relief to wash over me, maybe even a sense of triumph. But instead, I felt the kind of dread you get when a storm is gathering on the horizon. You don't hear thunder yet, but the air feels charged, restless, unnatural. The house came into view, its windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. But instead of warmth, it looked like a fortress, a place where danger didn't shout, but whispered. As I parked, I noticed something unsettling. Her car was still in the driveway. She rarely stayed home this time of day. It was almost as if she'd been waiting. Inside, the atmosphere was thick, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The duffel bag was back in the trunk, emptied of its secret, but I still felt exposed, vulnerable. And then I heard it, her voice. Not the melodic charm she used with outsiders, but low and deliberate, floating from the living room. She was on the phone, and though I couldn't make out the full conversation, a few phrases cut through. "Yes, he's acting different. No, I'll handle it. He won't get far." My stomach twisted. She knew. Maybe not exactly what I had done, but she sensed the shift. Her instincts were uncanny, almost predatory. That I retreated to my room, shutting the door with careful quiet, and collapsed onto the bed. My mind spun with images, her finding the hidden ledger, her realizing it was gone, her piecing together my visit to the attorney. I replayed every glance, every word exchanged in the kitchen earlier. She hadn't been fooled. She had simply let me go, which meant she was planning something of her own. For the first time, I wondered if I was safe in the house at all. My father's presence used to anchor me here, even when his silence hurt. But now, with him gone, it was just her world. I was the intruder, the liability, the loose thread she might decide to cut before I unraveled more of her carefully spun fabric. Sleep was impossible that night. Every creak of the house set me on edge. Every shadow sliding across the ceiling felt like her silhouette. I could almost picture her moving quietly through the hallways, listening, waiting for the moment I slipped. When morning came, the kitchen table held a small surprise, a plate of pancakes, perfectly stacked, with syrup warmed beside them. She sat at the head of the table, her smile wide, her posture relaxed. Too relaxed. "Thought you could use a good breakfast," she said smoothly, gesturing for me to sit. The gesture felt less like kindness and more like bait. My heart pounded as I lowered into the chair, every bite tasting like suspicion. The sweetness of syrup couldn't mask the bitterness in her gaze. She was watching me too closely, studying every twitch, every hesitation. And then she said it, with a casual tone that cut like a blade. "You've been busy lately." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. The fork froze halfway to my mouth. I forced a smile, but inside, alarm bells screamed. She knew. Not everything, perhaps. Not yet. But she knew enough to be dangerous. And I realized then, getting the ledger to the attorney hadn't been the end of this nightmare. It was only the beginning. It hit me like a physical weight when the attorney called to say he had filed the initial motion. Hearing the words through the phone made the world feel both smaller and sharper, like someone had refocused the lens of my whole life. He described the paperwork in clinical terms: an emergency petition alleging undue influence, a request to freeze major transfers, a motion to have the will examined for irregularities. To him, it was process. To me, it was the only thing standing between what my father meant and what had been done to him. The relief was unexpected and immediate, but it was also brittle. The attorney's tone carried a caution I could feel in my bones. The courts moved slowly, and paperwork could be countered. She had resources. She could hire lawyers of her own, discredit witnesses, or declare my actions destabilizing. The legal road was not a guaranteed triumph. It was an examen of endurance. I began preparing for that endurance. Every witness I'd quietly spoken to was asked to write a short, factual statement. I met the nurse again in a fluorescent-lit hospital cafeteria and watched her hands tremble as she insisted on including dates and times, refusing to editorialize. The business associate came to a small private room and refused coffee, but he wrote down, in his plain way, the fragments he had overheard that night at my father's house. Each note became a stitch in the legal fabric we were weaving. At home, the atmosphere broke into a dangerous pattern. Her actions grew almost performative, small displays of misplaced generosity, big gestures in front of people to show control, sudden calls to relatives with dramatic stories about how the family had to pull together. Yet between the shows, she ramped up the pressure in quieter ways. She rearranged files in the study to create confusion, subtly altered labels on folders, and left the house smelling of some new expensive perfume that stung the back of my throat. She was trying to shape the narrative before the court could. Late one night, exhausted and raw, I found evidence she hadn't accounted for. A transferred email chain on my father's old account. Altered headers that suggested someone had accessed his messages after he was no longer well. It was sloppy, amateurish for someone so careful, and because of that it was useful. It showed intent, not accident. I copied it, stored it, and added it to the pile. Still, nothing hardened me like the day the attorney said there would be a hearing. The judge would review whether the estate should be frozen pending full probate review. That hearing would be a public stage for secrets we had kept quiet. I imagined faces in the courtroom: the measured judge, the steely-faced opposing counsel, and my stepmother, composed and cruel, watching me like a hawk. My palms went cold at the thought. I wasn't the kind of man who wanted confrontation in public, but the ledger and the witnesses had put me in a place where confrontation was inevitable. On the morning of the hearing, the house felt electrically charged. She moved through it like royalty in exile, choosing what to wear with an eye for optics rather than comfort. I left early to meet the attorney, my suit feeling too new, my voice unnaturally steady when he asked if I was ready. In the car on the way, I kept reviewing in my head the statements, the ledger entries, the evidence, forcing every fact into a narrative that a judge might understand. I walked into the courtroom with a lean that felt like armor. The hearing lasted hours, more procedural than dramatic at first, but the attorney's calm presentation made the ledger and the testimonies breathe. He pointed to dates, to transfers before my father's decline, to the variance in signature. The opposing lawyer spoke in smooth tones about family harmony and elderly confusion. My stepmother sat untouched and composed, but I watched sweat gather at her temple, tiny and human. When the judge announced a temporary freeze on major asset transfers and ordered an independent expert to verify the signatures, something close to relief washed through me. It was only temporary, but it was enough. The house's assets could not be moved while the law examined what had been done. I could breathe, but I also felt the gravity of what came next. This wasn't the end of the fight. It was the moment the fight moved from whisper to law. Freedom came with a cost. The legal measure had bought time, but it also lit the fuse under our lives. In the weeks that followed, the house multiplied into two worlds: the legal world, where affidavits and expert reports accumulated in files, and the domestic world, where every glance and every plate of food could be read as a move in a chess game. She grew more theatrical. She invited relatives and neighbors, staging small gatherings where she smiled and laughed and let the cameras of social media record her as the dutiful widow. There were messages of condolence that felt rehearsed, donations in my father's name listed publicly. Her performance was not just to charm the community, it was to influence perception, to make her case outside the courtrooms where judges only saw what the lawyers showed them. Meanwhile, I kept a quieter, less visible campaign. I pressed the attorney for thoroughness. We subpoenaed bank records, cross-referenced dates, and worked with a handwriting expert who could compare my father's known signatures to the shaky one on the will. Each new piece of evidence tightened the noose around the story she'd crafted. But it also meant exposing private things about my father's decline to formal scrutiny, and that felt like ripping open a wound that would never fully heal at home. The tension became psychological warfare. She scheduled confrontations in the least confrontational ways, leaving a family photograph with a face scratched out, moving an old letter into a prominent position, sending texts that implied she knew things she couldn't possibly know. The aim seemed to be to destabilize me emotionally, to make me doubt the fairness of my own motives in the eyes of distant relatives who might be called as character witnesses on her side. Then came the sting I hadn't expected. During a routine visit to the bank to request records the attorney needed, I found our family listed in a local gossip column, a vague piece about a troubled family estate, hinting at scandal. The piece was sterile on facts but poisonous in implications. Someone was planting the idea that the son had been aggressive, opportunistic, helping an angle that undermined family unity. In the court of public opinion, perception could be as decisive as proof. Despite that, the handwriting expert's preliminary report landed like a hammer. The expert's analysis described statistical anomalies, stroke pressure inconsistent with my father's typical movement patterns, letter formations that suggested guided signatures. The report was careful, measured, temperate, but to me it read like a verdict. I printed it, carried it home, and read it until the letters blurred. She denied everything when faced with the document, of course. Her denials were layered: indignation at being accused, claims that my father had been in confusion, and veiled threats that pursuing the matter could harm family relations forever. But her anger couldn't mask the tremor in her hands or the way her prepared speeches misfired in private. The more I watched, the more I saw the seams of the in the quiet hours, lying awake. I felt the full weight of what we were doing. I was not only fighting for assets. I was fighting for the truth of the last months of my father's life. I pictured him in his study, the ledger hidden beneath dust, his voice muttering decisions I could no longer fully trust. The law might right wrongs on paper, but it could never return what had been stolen, the moments he might have chosen if he'd been free. That truth haunted me. The final hearing was a long, strange day. Experts testified, voice recordings were logged, bank tables were presented like pieces of a puzzle. I sat in the gallery and watched the formal machinery of justice work, dry, relentless, methodical. At times I felt like a spectator at my own life's unmaking. At other times, I felt the steady courage of a man who had chosen the harder right. When the judge rendered a more comprehensive ruling, it was measured justice. The court found enough evidence to order a full forensic review of the will and to appoint a neutral conservator to protect the estate during the investigation. The judge's language was cautious but unequivocal. Any transfers made under potential undue influence would be subject to reversal pending final determination. Walking out of the courthouse, the sky felt strangely clear, as if the world had been scrubbed. People whose faces I barely recognized clustered near the steps. Neighbors, reporters, family friends, each with their own quiet questions. My stepmother passed me nearby, flanked by a lawyer who wore a practiced calm. She looked at me then, not with triumph, not with fury, but with something close to resignation. Her eyes betrayed the cost her scheme had exacted on her own life, the performances, the calculated smiles, the slow erosion of solitude into suspicion in the months that followed. The forensic reviews and legal maneuvers continued. Some transfers were reversed, corporate accounts were untangled, and pieces that had been funneled away began to be accounted for again. The attorney told me we'd done what was possible within the system. He warned me it would not be a clean, fast victory. It was a long process of repairs, hearings, and sometimes painful revelations about my father's last decisions, about the people who had moved too freely in his illness, and about the messy intersection of love, greed, and loneliness. The house returned, slowly, to a kind of peace. Not the naive warmth of before. Grief and betrayal had altered everything, but a steadier calm. I kept the ledger in a safety deposit box after the court directed it as evidence, and visited the study only to sit with my father's books, running a hand over spines he had touched. Sometimes I spoke aloud to the memory of him, apologizing for the ways the end had been clouded. And in the end, the victory was not only legal. It was moral. The court's orders exposed the truth enough that my father's final wishes, so far as they could be discerned, were treated with the respect he deserved. People who had stood quiet returned and spoke about the pressure they'd seen. Friends I hadn't expected to support the fight wrote letters. Justice, imperfect and slow, stitched together a better approximation of what should have been. There was no grand, cinematic confrontation where everything crashed down on her in one dramatic moment. Instead, the ruin of the scheme was a slow unspooling. Accounts audited, signatures questioned, the small theatrical gestures she used to charm onlookers revealed as armor for something colder. She moved away from the house in time, quietly, with legal counsel arranging terms that kept matters civil and public. I felt guilty and relieved in measures that didn't reckon easily. What remained for me was the complicated work of mourning a father whose final chapter had been bartered over. There were days of bitter anger and nights of quiet gratitude for the chance to bring truth forward. There was reconciliation of memory, accepting that he had been vulnerable and that others had taken advantage, but also honoring the man he had been in life. When I finally sat alone in the study and opened one of his old ledgers that had never been touched, the familiar smell of paper and cigar smoke rose up, and something in me eased. I had taken on a fight that had felt impossible, and, through grit and legal counsel and the courage of a few quiet witnesses, had forced the truth into daylight. It didn't fix everything, and it didn't erase the betrayal, but it returned to him something more important than money: the dignity of being heard. The house no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a place where the past had been examined, the wrongs acknowledged, and a future could be built on clearer ground. Thank you for watching this story on True Tales Hub. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. That we post new tales twice a day, and each one comes with unexpected twists you won't see coming.